The stagecoach wheels ground against the frozen, rutted earth, coming to a violent halt that threw Clara against the splintering wooden frame. Dust and snow swirled through the cracked window, settling on her dark wool traveling cloak like ash. She pressed a trembling, gloved hand to her chest, trying to steady the frantic beating of her heart. Outside lay the frontier town of Blackwood Ridge, a jagged collection of weathered timber and smoking chimneys that looked as though the earth had violently pushed it up from the rocks. When Clara stepped out into the biting wind, she felt the eyes of the settlement instantly upon her. Men with calloused hands and frostbitten cheeks paused their labor. Women wrapped in heavy shawls stared from the mercantile porch. Clara kept her chin lifted. She was a ghost in a navy dress, a woman dead to the world she had left behind. In her small trunk lay 3 simple dresses, a silver locket, and hidden beneath the false bottom, the ledger that could send her powerful, corrupt uncle to the gallows. It was the same ledger that had made her a target for murder in her own home. "You the mail-order bride?" The voice belonged to the stage driver, his breath pluming in the freezing air as he tossed her trunk onto the hard dirt. "I am expected," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the icy wind slicing through her clothes. 3 weeks ago, she had answered a terse advertisement in a Boston paper. Widower, mountain territory, needs a wife for labor and children, no romance. It was a suicide mission for a city woman, but it was the only train ticket out of a death sentence. A heavy silence fell over the street. The sound of hooves crunching on ice broke the quiet. He rode down the center of the settlement like a dark storm gathering over the peaks. Silas was a mountain of a man clad in a thick, worn buffalo hide coat. A shadow of a hat was pulled low over eyes that were cold, piercing, and entirely devoid of welcome. A dark, untamed beard framed a jaw set like granite. He sat atop a massive black draft horse, exuding a silent, coiled strength that made the townsfolk step back. He brought the beast to a halt. Silas did not smile. He did not offer a greeting. His eyes swept over Clara's refined, shivering form, registering her delicate gloves and pale skin with a singular flinch of profound disappointment. "You, Clara?" His voice was a low rumble, rough like boulders grinding together in a landslide. "I am. Trunk small." He swung down from the saddle with terrifying grace, his boots hitting the frozen mud with a heavy thud. Without another word, he hoisted her luggage as if it weighed no more than a bundle of kindling and secured it behind his saddle. He turned back to her, extending a massive leather-clad hand. "Climb up, storm's coming. We don't beat it, we freeze." Clara stared at the sheer size of the horse, then at Silas's hand. There was no gentleness in his posture. She placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was iron. In one effortless motion, he hoisted her up, seating her sideways behind the saddle. He mounted in front of her, his broad back a solid wall of muscle and thick hide. "Hold the coat," Silas commanded over his shoulder. "If you fall, the mountain takes you. I don't turn back." He spurred the horse. They left Blackwood Ridge behind, ascending into a wilderness that grew more hostile with every passing mile. The wind howled through the skeletal pines, a high, lonely shriek. The temperature plummeted. Clara buried her face against the rough wool of Silas's back, her fingers gripping the thick fabric until her knuckles ached. The trail narrowed into a terrifying ribbon of ice and rock flanked by sheer drops into bottomless snow-choked canyons. For 2 hours, the only sounds were the crunch of hooves, the wind, and the ragged sound of Clara's own shivering breaths. Silas did not speak. He merely adjusted his weight, shielding her from the worst of the biting wind with his massive frame. It was a brutal, wordless protection. They breached the tree line as the sky bruised into a violent purple. Tucked against a sheer rock face sat a cabin of raw logs and stone. Smoke leaked thinly from a crooked stone chimney. It was a fortress of survival, grim and uninviting. Silas dismounted and reached up his large hands, gripping her waist to lower her to the ground. Clara's legs gave way the moment her boots hit the snow. She stumbled, but Silas caught her by the elbow, his grip bruising but secure, holding her upright until she found her footing. "Cabin's open," he grunted, turning to the horse. "Go?" Clara pushed open the heavy timber door. The interior was a shock of cold and squalor. A cast-iron stove sat in the corner, barely radiating heat, choked with white ash. The floorboards were caked with dried mud and debris. The scent of unwashed wool, stale grease, and despair hung heavy in the air. From the shadows of the main room, 3 pairs of eyes watched her. The oldest, a boy of about 13 with Silas's dark hair and a defensive slouch, stood by the table. Wyatt. Beside him was a girl of perhaps 8. Cora, her dress, a ragged patchwork of faded cotton, her hair a tangled bird's nest. Peeking from behind Cora's skirt was a little boy Levi no more than 5, clutching a piece of carved firewood like a doll. They looked like wild trapped animals. "You ain't staying," Wyatt spat, his voice cracking with adolescent anger. "Last one only made it a month. You look like you'll freeze by morning." Clara slowly unpinned her hat, setting it on the dusty table. The cold inside the cabin was seeping into her bones, but she had stared down a murderer in a Boston parlor. She would not be intimidated by a grieving child. "Then I suppose I have until morning to make myself useful," Clara said evenly. The heavy door creaked open, admitting Silas and a blast of freezing wind. He dropped her trunk in the corner. His eyes flicked from his hostile son to Clara's pale face. He walked to the stove, grabbed a heavy iron poker, and viciously struck the dying embers. Sparks flew into the dim room. "Wyatt goats need hay. Cora fetch snow for the kettle. Levi out of the way," Silas barked. The children scattered instantly, obeying the tone of absolute authority. Silas slowly turned to Clara. "Wife sleeps in the back room. With me. Cookpots are under the table, flowers in the barrel. We eat what we have when we have it. Don't expect conversation." Clara swallowed the lump of terror in her throat. "I understand. I only asked for water to wash and a moment to change." Silas stared at her. His gaze was heavy, carrying the weight of a man who had dug too many graves in the frozen earth. "Pump's frozen out back. You want water, you break the ice in the creek." He turned his back on her, throwing another log into the stove. The flames hissed and spat. Clara stood in the center of the filthy room, the icy draft cutting through her thin stockings. The mountain wanted her dead, her uncle wanted her dead, and the man she had just married expected her to fail. Clara quietly unbuttoned her cloak. She found the heavy iron bucket near the door, wrapped her bruised hands around the freezing metal handle, and stepped back out into the howling dark. She had survived the predators of high society. She would survive the ice. Dawn broke over the frontier like a cracked pane of glass, pale, sharp, and unforgiving. Clara woke shivering violently. The mattress was stuffed with dry grass that poked through the thin ticking. Beside her, the bed was empty. Silas had risen long before the sun, leaving no trace of warmth. She dressed with clumsy, numb fingers, pulling on her thickest brown wool dress, though it felt as thin as paper against the mountain chill. When she stepped into the main room, the fire was nothing but glowing orange teeth in the belly of the iron stove. Wyatt sat at the scarred wooden table, whittling a stick with a hunting knife, wood shavings falling onto the muddy floorboards. "Fire's dying," the boy said without looking up. Clara looked at the empty wood box. "Where does your father keep the kindling?" "Out back, under the snow." Wyatt's lips curled into a cruel smirk. "Pa said if you wanted to be warm, you had to work for it." Clara didn't argue. She found an oversized, moth-eaten coat hanging on a peg, likely belonging to Silas's first wife, and wrapped it around her shoulders. She pushed through the back door. The wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. The woodpile was buried under a fresh foot of snow. She dropped to her knees, digging with her bare, raw hands until she found the frozen logs. By the time she hauled a heavy armful back inside, her fingers were blue and screaming in pain. She fed the stove, blowing on the embers until the flames caught the dry bark. The fire cracked and popped, throwing a meager warmth into the room. Breakfast was a grim affair. Clara managed to scrape together a hard cornmeal mush, boiling it in an iron pot that had a permanent crust of old grease on the bottom. When Silas returned from the tree line, his beard was crusted with white frost. He stomped the snow from his heavy boots, the sound echoing like gunshots in the quiet cabin. He took his bowl in silence. Clara watched him eat. His movements were mechanical, focused purely on fueling his massive body for labor. He did not look at her, nor did he offer a word of thanks. "The laundry needs doing," Silas said suddenly, staring at the bottom of his empty bowl. "Pile's in the corner. Creek's half frozen, but the water runs fast enough at the bend." He stood grabbing his rifle. "Wyatt, with me to the ridge." Clara looked at the corner of the room. A mountain of filthy, stiff clothing lay there, denim caked with mud and blood wool, smelling of sweat and wood smoke. It looked impossible. But as Silas paused at the door, his broad shoulders filling the frame, Clara lifted her chin. "It will be done," she said. Silas paused, a muscle ticking in his jaw. He gave a single tight nod and vanished into the whiteout. Carrying the massive laundry basket down the treacherous, icy slope to the creek took everything Clara had. She slipped twice, tearing her stockings and bruising her knees against the hidden rocks. When she finally reached the water, the reality of her task set in. The creek was bordered by jagged white ice. The water rushed over black stones, looking cold enough to shatter bone. Clara knelt on the frozen bank. She plunged the first heavy wool shirt into the water. The cold was absolute agony. It felt as though her hands had been thrust into a bed of burning coals. She gasped, tears springing instantly to her eyes, but there was no one to hear her, no one to care. She dragged the heavy wet wool onto a flat rock and began to scrub with a bar of harsh lye soap. The lye ate at her delicate, blistered skin. Within 20 minutes, her knuckles were bleeding, the crimson drops washing away instantly in the freezing current. "I am alive," she repeated to herself, a desperate mantra against the howl of the wind. "I am alive!" A twig snapped. Clara whipped around, her wet hands raised instinctively. Cora stood a few yards away, bundled in a ragged shawl, watching her with wide, haunted eyes. The little girl didn't speak. She just stared at the blood on Clara's hands. "Hello, Cora," Clara said, her voice shaking violently from the cold. The girl took a step back like a startled deer. "My ma used to sing when she washed," Cora whispered, the sound barely carrying over the rushing water. "Before she got sick and died in the bed." Clara's heart constricted. She looked down at the freezing water, then back up at the broken little girl. Clara didn't know any frontier songs. She only knew the mournful hymns of Boston chapels and the classical piano tunes her uncle had forced her to learn. Drawing a ragged, shivering breath, Clara began to hum a soft, sweeping lullaby. Her teeth chattered, breaking the melody, but she pushed the sound out into the freezing air. She scrubbed the denim, humming through the agonizing pain in her hands. Cora didn't run away. She stepped closer, sitting on a dry stump, pulling her knees to her chest, and just listened. By the time Clara hauled the wet, freezing laundry back up the mountain, her arms felt like lead. She hung the garments on a rope strung between two pines near the stove, letting the heat slowly thaw the stiffened fabric. When Silas and Wyatt returned at dusk, the cabin smelled faintly of lye soap and boiled potatoes. The floors had been swept clear of the worst of the mud. Silas stopped in the doorway, his eyes taking in the clean clothes drying by the fire, then dropping to Clara. She was standing by the table, her hands wrapped tightly in a clean rag. The white cloth was stained with fresh seeping pink. Silas stepped fully into the room. He walked past her, silent as a ghost, and went into the bedroom. When he emerged, he held a small tin of bear fat and pine resin. He dropped it on the table in front of her. It hit the wood with a heavy thwack. "For the cracks," he said roughly, his voice a low rumble. "Infection takes a hand up here faster than frostbite. Use it." Clara looked at the tin, then up into his dark storm cloud eyes. "Thank you." Silas didn't reply. He turned away, disappearing back into the harsh reality of his silence. But that night, when Clara lay shivering on her side of the freezing mattress, she felt the mattress shift. Silas moved a fraction of an inch closer. He didn't touch her, but the massive, radiating heat of his body was a silent, deliberate shield against the cold draft leaking through the log walls. The storm did not arrive. It descended, a suffocating blanket of white fury that swallowed the mountain whole. For 3 days, the wind battered the log walls like a living beast, trying to tear the roof from its moorings. Inside, the cabin became a dark, smoky tomb. The fire was stoked constantly, yet the cold crept through the floorboards, frosting the edges of the windows. Clara worked relentlessly. She baked heavy loaves of oat bread, mended Wyatt's torn trousers, and kept Cora and Levi occupied with stories she half remembered from her childhood. Silas paced the small room. He was a creature of the open wilderness, and being trapped inside made him restless. His massive shoulders tense, his dark eyes constantly drifting to the frosted glass. On the fourth morning, a sound cut through the howling wind, a sharp, splintering crack, followed by the frantic bleating of animals. Silas was at the door before Clara could draw a breath, his rifle in one hand, his heavy coat hauled over his shoulders. Wyatt was right behind him. "Pens gave way under the drift," Silas threw the words over his shoulder. "Goats are scattering into the timber. If we lose them, we starve come February." He shoved out into the blinding white. Wyatt followed. The door slammed shut, plunging the cabin back into a shivering silence. Clara stood by the stove. She looked at the two younger children huddled under a wool blanket on the bed. Levi was trembling, his wide eyes fixed on the door. "Stay here," Clara commanded, her voice brooking no argument. "Do not move from this bed." She pulled on her boots, wrapped the oversized moth-eaten coat tightly around her, and tied a woolen scarf over her head. The moment she stepped outside, the wind knocked her back a step. The cold was a physical wall. The air was thick with swirling snow, reducing visibility to mere yards. She fought her way toward the splintered remains of the goat pen. Tracks led into the dark, swaying pines. She could faintly hear Silas shouting commands to Wyatt. Clara pushed into the tree line, the snow drifts reaching her thighs. The cold seeped through her boots instantly. She found one shivering goat pinned against a boulder, its wool matted with ice. She grabbed it by the horns, dragging the struggling animal back toward the remains of the pen, securing it in the one corner that still held a roof. She turned back to find more, but a flash of movement caught her eye. Down the slope, near the creek. It was small, a flash of a blue woolen cap. Levi. The little boy had not stayed in the bed. Perhaps he wanted to help his father, or perhaps he chased a stray goat. Clara's heart stopped. Levi, she screamed, but the wind snatched the name from her throat and tore it to shreds. She fought her way down the slope, her breath burning in her lungs like inhaled glass. The creek was a dark, jagged scar through the white landscape. The water moved sluggishly in the center, flanked by treacherous shelves of ice. Levi was standing on the ice. He was reaching for a small brown kid goat that had wandered onto the frozen surface. "Levi, stop!" Clara shrieked, abandoning caution, lunging through the deep snow. The boy turned. His small face was red with cold, his eyes wide with innocent confusion. Then came the sound. It was distinct, echoing louder than the storm. Crack! Like a rifle shot. The ice beneath Levi's boots spiderwebbed. Clara did not think. The survival instinct that had brought her across the country, that had kept her alive in the freezing cabin, surged into an absolute, blinding, singular focus. She hit the edge of the creek at a dead run just as the ice gave way. Levi vanished. The black water swallowed him whole. Clara threw herself forward, sliding across the breaking ice. It shattered beneath her weight, plunging her into the freezing depths. The shock of the cold was an act of violence. It struck the air from her lungs in a violent gasp, driving thousands of icy needles into her skin. Darkness enveloped her. The current was terrifyingly strong, pulling at her heavy wool coat, threatening to drag her beneath the thick ice sheet further downstream, where she would never surface. She forced her eyes open. The water was murky, stinging, rushing with brutal force. She thrashed her arms, fighting the agonizing paralysis creeping into her limbs. A pale shape tumbled in the current just ahead of her. Clara kicked her muscles, burning, screaming for oxygen. She reached out with her numb, blistered hands. Her fingers snagged on heavy, wet wool. She gripped Levi's coat and hauled him toward her. She kicked upward, breaking the surface. Air rushed into her lungs in a jagged, agonizing sob. Levi was coughing a weak, wet sound, his face deathly pale. Clara wrapped one arm around his small chest, using her other hand to claw at the jagged edge of the ice. The current tore at her legs. Her fingers, bleeding and frozen, slipped on the smooth ice. "Silas!" she screamed, the sound tearing her throat. "Silas!" The ice broke under her hand. She slipped backward, the water dragging her down again. She hoisted Levi higher, keeping his face above the surface, kicking with the last remnants of her fading strength. The cold was moving into her core, slowing her heart, wrapping her brain in a thick, dark fog. She was losing her grip. Then a roar shattered the wind. A massive shape loomed over the edge of the ice. Silas dropped to his stomach, sliding dangerously close to the broken edge. His giant hand plunged into the freezing water. His iron grip clamped around Clara's wrist bone, crushing and absolute. "Hold on to the boy!" Silas bellowed, his voice raw with pure, unadulterated terror. With a surge of terrifying strength, Silas hauled backward. He dragged Clara and Levi out of the black water, pulling them over the jagged ice and onto the snow-covered bank. Clara collapsed onto the freezing earth, gasping violently, her body convulsing in uncontrollable shivers. She was entirely numb, yet every nerve ending was screaming. Next to her, Levi was limp, his lips tinted blue, his breathing dangerously shallow. Silas fell to his knees in the snow. He stripped off his heavy buffalo coat and wrapped it entirely around his son, pulling the tiny, freezing body against his chest. His chest heaved as he looked down at Clara. His dark eyes, usually so guarded and cold, were blown wide, stripped of all defenses. He saw the ice clinging to her hair, the purple hue of her lips, the blood from her torn hands staining the snow. "Wyatt!" Silas roared, a sound that shook the very timber. The older boy came sliding down the slope, skidding to a halt, his face draining of color. "Take the boy, run to the cabin, get him by the fire, strip the wet clothes, go!" Wyatt grabbed his little brother, hauling him up, and sprinted up the slope with desperate speed. Silas turned back to Clara. She tried to push herself up, but her arms buckled. The hypothermia was setting in fast, dragging her into a seductive, lethargic darkness. "Clara, look at me." Silas's voice was ragged. He didn't wait for her to answer. He scooped her up from the snow. Her heavy, waterlogged clothes made her a dead weight, but he carried her as if she weighed nothing. He held her tight against his chest, his powerful legs driving them up the steep, snowy incline. "Stay awake," he commanded, his breath hot against her freezing cheek. "Do not close your eyes. You hear me? You don't get to die on my mountain. Not today." Clara rested her heavy head against his shoulder. Through the freezing agony, through the roar of the blizzard, she felt the frantic, heavy pounding of his heart beneath his shirt. It was the only warm thing left in the world. The journey up the slope was an eternity of biting wind and blinding white. Silas did not falter. His boots punched deep holes in the snow, his muscles straining against the incline and the brutal elements. Clara's vision narrowed to the rough weave of his flannel shirt. She felt the violent shivers racking her own body, a desperate attempt by her failing heart to generate heat. He kicked the heavy cabin door open. The heat of the stove hit Clara like a physical blow, making her skin burn and sting in protest. The cabin was in chaos. Wyatt had laid Levi on the rug nearest the stove and was frantically pulling off the boy's soaked clothes. Cora was crying silently in the corner, clutching her knees. Silas set Clara down on a heavy wooden chair near the fire. "Strip the wet things off," he ordered, his voice thick with panic, masked as authority. "Everything, now." Clara's fingers were useless, curled into stiff white claws. She couldn't grasp the buttons of her coat, let alone the laces of her boots. She sat there, shaking violently, her teeth rattling so hard her jaw ached. Silas cursed softly. He dropped to his knees in front of her. His massive hands, usually so rough and capable of violence, were surprisingly steady as he worked the frozen buttons of her coat. He peeled the heavy wool away, throwing it to the floor. He didn't hesitate. He pulled off her soaked boots, then reached for the hem of her ruined, freezing dress. Clara made a weak, protesting sound in her throat, a faint instinct of modesty surviving the cold. "Pride won't keep your heart beating, woman," Silas said fiercely, his eyes fixed firmly on the task, refusing to look at her bare skin. He stripped away the freezing layers until she was left in only her thin-soaked chemise. He grabbed the thickest wool blanket from the bed and wrapped it tightly around her shoulders, rubbing her arms vigorously to force the blood back into her limbs. "Wyatt," Silas called out, not looking away from Clara. "How's the boy?" "He's breathing, Pa." Wyatt's voice shook. "But he's cold. He's so cold." Silas turned his head. Levi lay naked near the stove, wrapped in 2 blankets, but his small chest was barely rising. The blue tint had not left his lips. The stove alone was not enough. The ambient air was too cold. Silas stood up. He walked to his son, his face a mask of grim determination. "Blankets ain't enough," he muttered. "Needs body heat." He looked at Wyatt. "Strip down. Get under the blankets with him. Skin to skin. Hold him tight." Wyatt didn't hesitate. He pulled off his shirt and trousers and scrambled under the heavy wool, wrapping his teenage arms around his freezing little brother. Silas turned back to Clara. She was huddled in the chair, the violent shaking beginning to slow, a terrifying sign that her body was giving up the fight. Her eyes were half closed, the lashes heavy with melting ice. Silas stared at her. This woman, a stranger from the city, a delicate creature sent to labor in his miserable home, had thrown herself into a frozen grave without a second thought to save his blood. The walls he had built around his shattered heart, walls of ice and silence and grief, cracked straight down the middle. He reached for the buttons of his own shirt. "Move to the bed," Silas commanded softly. Clara blinked, her brain processing the words too slowly. She tried to stand, but her legs collapsed. Silas caught her before she hit the floorboards. He carried her to the straw mattress, laying her down. He stripped off his shirt, baring his broad, scarred chest to the cold cabin air. He climbed onto the bed beside her, pulling the heavy quilts over them both. He gathered her freezing, shivering body against him. Clara gasped as the intense, radiating heat of his bare skin pressed against her own. She curled into him, instinctively burying her icy face in the crook of his neck, her frozen hands resting flat against his chest. Silas wrapped his massive arms around her, cocooning her in a fortress of muscle and warmth. "Breathe," he whispered into her damp hair, his voice rough and broken. "Just keep breathing, Clara. I've got you." Outside, the blizzard raged, trying to tear the world apart. But inside the dark, smoky cabin, wrapped in the arms of a broken mountain man, Clara slowly stopped shivering. She closed her eyes, anchored by the steady, powerful thud of his heart. She was safe. For the first time in her life, she was truly safe. The return of sensation was worse than the freezing. It started as a dull, throbbing ache deep in Clara's bones, then bloomed into a fierce, prickling fire that raced across every inch of her skin. She gasped, her back arching off the straw mattress as the agonizing pins and needles of thawing flesh tore a whimper from her throat. I know it burns. Let it burn, Clara. It means your blood is moving." Silas's voice was a low, steady rumble against her ear. His arms tightened around her, a vice of muscle and radiating heat. He had not moved an inch. Outside, the blizzard continued to scream against the log walls, but the world inside the heavy quilts was anchored entirely by the massive, scarred chest pressed against her back, and the heavy limbs tangling with hers. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the wave of nausea that accompanied the painful thaw. She was acutely aware of his bare skin, of the coarse hair on his chest, of the powerful rhythmic thud of his heart against her spine. "Levi," she gasped out the word, tearing her dry throat. He's warm," Silas answered immediately. "Wyatt's got him. He woke up an hour ago crying for you. He drank some warm broth and went back to sleep. You saved him, Clara." A fractured sob broke from Clara's lips. The adrenaline that had propelled her into the freezing black water finally evaporated, leaving behind a terrifying vulnerability. She wept the tears hot and fast soaking into Silas's shoulder. She cried for the sheer terror of the ice, for the weeks of isolation, for the constant fear of the men hunting her, and for the agonizing realization that she had finally found something on this desolate mountain that she could not bear to lose. Silas did not shush her. He did not tell her to be strong. He simply shifted his weight, turning her gently so she faced him in the dim, smoky light of the cabin. His large, calloused hand came up his thumb, carefully brushing away the tears that mingled with the melting ice in her hair. His touch was shockingly tender for a man who seemed carved from granite. "You're safe," he murmured, his dark eyes searching her pale face. "You hear me. Nothing takes you on my watch." They lay there as the hours bled away. The fire in the stove crackled, filling the room with the scent of pine pitch and wood smoke. As Clara's violent shivering finally subsided into a bone-deep exhaustion, the rigid lines of Silas's body began to relax. The sheer physical proximity born of desperate survival shifted into something profound and quiet. "Why?" Silas asked suddenly, his voice a gravelly whisper in the dark. "Why did you jump? You didn't owe us that. You didn't owe me anything. I brought you here to work. I treated you like a hired hand. And you threw yourself into a frozen river for my boy." Clara looked up at him. The flickering firelight danced across his harsh bearded jaw and the deep grief-carved lines around his eyes. "Because he is a child," Clara whispered, her voice still raspy. "And because when I looked at him on that ice, I didn't see a burden. I saw family. I never had a real one, Silas. Not one that wouldn't sell me for a handful of silver. When the ice broke, I didn't think. I just knew I couldn't let the mountain take him." Silas's jaw worked. He swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to the painful red blisters forming on her knuckles from the lye soap and the jagged ice. He took her injured hand with agonizing care, resting it flat against his chest right over his beating heart. "My first wife, Sarah," Silas began, the words pulled from a deep locked vault inside him. "She died in this bed. Fever took her after Levi was born. I sat right where you're lying and I watched the life bleed out of her and I couldn't do a damn thing. The mountain didn't care how hard I fought." He paused, a ragged breath shuddering through his massive frame. "After that, the quiet in this cabin nearly drove me mad. The children were grieving, turning wild. I thought bringing a woman here would fix them, but the women who came, they looked at my kids like they were feral dogs. They looked at me like I was a monster. They couldn't handle the cold or the silence or the work. They broke. So when you arrived in your fine city clothes, I figured you wouldn't last the week. I figured it was better to freeze you out early than let the kids get attached and watch you run away." He leaned closer, his forehead resting gently against hers. "I was a fool. You're the strongest thing that ever walked onto this ridge." Clara closed her eyes, leaning into his warmth. "I'm not strong, Silas. I'm a fugitive." Silas pulled back slightly, his brow furrowing. "Fugitive from what?" "From my uncle, Thaddeus Harrow." Clara confessed the truth pouring out of her like blood from a wound. "He is a wealthy man in Boston, a corrupt man. I found ledgers in his study, proof of embezzlement, bribery, and the murder of a shipping rival. He caught me reading them. That night, I overheard him telling his men to arrange a tragic accident for me. A fall down the stairs, a carriage crash." She shuddered, the memory chilling her more than the ice. "I stole the ledgers. I hid them in the false bottom of my trunk. I saw your advertisement and I ran. I married a stranger in the wilderness because it was the only place Thaddeus's men wouldn't look. I am a danger to you, Silas. If they find me, let them come." Silas interrupted, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. The protective instinct radiating from him was palpable, a physical force filling the small bed. "Let them step foot on this mountain. They'll find out what kind of man they're dealing with." He reached up, his rough fingers tangling in her damp hair, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. "You didn't just marry a stranger, Clara. You married me. You saved my blood. That makes you mine. And what's mine I protect. Do you understand?" Clara looked into those fierce dark eyes and saw no hesitation, no fear, only an absolute unshakable vow. "I understand," she whispered. Silas slowly leaned down. His lips brushed hers, hesitant at first, testing the boundaries of this new fragile trust. Clara exhaled a shaky breath and leaned up, pressing her mouth fully against his. The kiss was a collision of relief and raw need. There was nothing gentle about the frontier, but there was a fierce protective reverence in the way Silas held her, as if she were the most precious thing he had ever touched. The cold cabin faded away, replaced entirely by the heat of his skin and the desperate possessive sweep of his mouth. The marriage of survival had ended. A true marriage had begun. When morning finally broke, the howling of the blizzard had ceased, leaving behind a profound crystalline silence. Clara woke to find Silas already dressed, feeding logs into the stove. He looked back at her, the harshness gone from his face, replaced by a quiet, territorial warmth. The children stirred. Wyatt was the first to rise from the rug where he had slept beside his brother. He looked at Clara sitting up in the bed, wrapped in Silas's shirt. The boy's hostile posture was gone. He walked over to the bed, his head bowed, twisting his suspenders in his hands. "Ma'am," Wyatt said, his voice cracking with emotion, I was wrong about you. I'm sorry for what I said. For the wood, for the water. You saved Levi. You're staying, ain't you?" Clara offered him a soft, reassuring smile. "I am staying, Wyatt, if you'll have me." Wyatt nodded fiercely, swiping a sleeve across his eyes before turning away to hide his tears. Cora crawled out from under her blanket, running straight to the bed and burying her face in Clara's side. Even Levi, pale but breathing steadily, managed a weak, sleepy smile from the floor. The ice in the cabin had broken. They were no longer strangers forced together by tragedy. They were a family forged in the freezing waters of the frontier. 4 weeks passed. The brutal grip of winter began to loosen, giving way to the fragile, muddy promise of an early spring thaw. The snowpack retreated, revealing the dark, resilient earth beneath. Life in the cabin had transformed. The air was no longer thick with grief and resentment. It hummed with the quiet rhythm of a shared life. Clara's hands had healed, scarred but calloused, strong enough to knead bread chop kindling and mend clothes without pain. Wyatt had become her fiercely loyal shadow, taking over the heaviest chores so she wouldn't strain herself. Cora sang old hymns while she swept the floors, her voice a sweet melody that chased the ghosts from the rafters. And Silas was a man reborn. The heavy burden of his silence had lifted. He touched Clara constantly, a hand on the small of her back as he passed her at the stove, a kiss pressed to her temple before he went out to hunt, a deep rumbling laugh when Levi chased the goats through the mud. But Clara knew the peace was fragile. The ledgers in her trunk were a ticking clock. It happened on a Tuesday. The sky was the color of bruised iron threatening rain. Silas and Wyatt had taken the draft horse and the wagon down the mountain to Blackwood Ridge for supplies, leaving Clara alone with the 2 younger children. Clara was in the yard pinning damp sheets to the washing line when the sound of approaching horses echoed up the canyon. It wasn't the slow, heavy plodding of Silas's draft horse. It was the sharp, quick rhythm of riding mounts. Clara froze. She peered through the hanging sheets. 2 men rode into the clearing. They wore long, dark dusters and bowler hats that looked utterly ridiculous in the wilderness, but there was nothing funny about the repeating rifles resting across their saddles. They had the cold, dead eyes of men who killed for a wage, Pinkerton men, or worse, Thaddeus's private enforcers. "Cora," Clara said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. The little girl looked up from the dirt where she was playing with Levi. "Take your brother. Go into the root cellar beneath the floorboards. Do not come out no matter what you hear. Go. Now." Cora saw the terror in Clara's eyes. The girl grabbed Levi's hand and scrambled toward the cabin door, disappearing inside. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out from behind the damp sheets. She stood in the center of the muddy yard, blocking the path to the cabin door. The riders pulled their horses to a halt. The lead man, sporting a jagged scar across his cheek, spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the snow. He looked Clara up and down, taking in her faded wool dress, her scarred hands, and the wild strands of hair escaping her braid. "Well now," the scarred man drawled, pulling a folded piece of paper from his coat. "Ain't you a long way from Beacon Hill, Miss Clara Harrow? Your uncle has been near out of his mind with worry." "My name is Clara," she said, her voice ringing out clear and steady. "And you are trespassing on my husband's land." The second man chuckled, swinging down from his horse. "Husband, that's rich. A fake marriage to a dirt-farming savage ain't gonna stop us, sweetheart. Mr. Harrow wants you back in Boston. He also wants the books you stole from his study. Hand 'em over and maybe we don't burn this miserable shack to the ground with whoever's inside it." "I don't know what you are talking about," Clara lied, her mind racing. Inside the cabin, resting on the mantel above the stove, was Silas's heavy Colt revolver. She just needed to get through the door. "Don't play stupid," the scarred man snarled, dismounting and pulling his rifle from the scabbard. "We tracked the stagecoach routes, cost Mr. Harrow a fortune in bribes, but we found you. Now fetch the ledgers or we start shooting." The men took a step forward. Clara didn't back down. She planted her boots in the mud, her chin held high, channeling every ounce of aristocratic defiance she possessed, but backing it with the feral courage she had learned on the mountain. "You step 1 foot closer to my home," Clara warned, her voice dropping to a lethal hiss, "and you will not leave this mountain alive." The scarred man laughed, raising the barrel of his rifle. "Feisty little bird, I think I'll enjoy breaking." A massive crack shattered the afternoon air. It wasn't a rifle shot. It was the sound of a heavy pine branch snapping under the weight of a boot. From the tree line behind the men, Silas emerged like a demon summoned from the earth. He didn't have his wagon. He didn't have Wyatt. He had doubled back through the timber on foot, tracking the unfamiliar horse prints that had veered onto his property. Silas's face was a mask of absolute terrifying murder. His dark eyes were fixed on the men threatening his wife. He didn't speak. He didn't issue a warning. He simply raised his Winchester lever-action rifle and fired. The shot blew the bowler hat clean off the scarred man's head, missing his skull by a fraction of an inch. The deafening roar echoed off the canyon walls. Both thugs jumped, spinning around in pure shock. Before they could raise their weapons, Silas racked the lever with blinding speed and fired again, shooting the rifle straight out of the second man's hands. The man screamed, clutching his shattered fingers as his weapon clattered into the mud. "Drop it!" Silas roared, stepping fully into the clearing. He looked twice the size of a normal man, a force of brutal nature wrapped in buffalo hide and vengeance. The scarred man, realizing he was caught dead to rights, dropped his rifle into the muck and raised his hands. His face had gone chalk white. Silas walked forward, his boots squelching in the mud. He stopped 3 feet from the scarred man. With a violent sweeping motion, Silas struck the man across the jaw with the heavy wooden stock of his rifle. The thug collapsed into the dirt, groaning and spitting blood. Silas racked the lever again, pointing the smoking barrel down at the 2 bleeding men. "You stepped on the wrong mountain," Silas growled, his voice vibrating with lethal intent. "You tell whatever rich coward sent you that Clara Harrow is dead. Clara is my wife. And if anyone from Boston comes looking for her again, I won't waste a bullet warning them. I'll bury them in the canyon." Silas looked over at Clara. "Get the ropes from the shed. We're tying them to their horses and sending them down to the marshal in Blackwood." Clara ran to the shed, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and overwhelming relief. Silas had come back. He had protected their home. That night, after the hired men had been marched down the mountain at gunpoint and handed over to the local lawman, the cabin was quiet again. The children were asleep. Silas sat at the wooden table, the dim light of the oil lamp casting long shadows over his face. Clara walked out of the bedroom carrying the heavy leather-bound ledgers. She set them on the table in front of him. "We can't keep waiting for them to come," Clara said quietly. "As long as these exist here, we are a target." Silas looked at the books, then up at her. "What do you want to do?" "We send them to the federal marshals in Washington, not Boston. Washington," Clara said, her voice firm. "We expose my uncle to the one authority he cannot bribe. It will destroy him. He will be ruined, imprisoned, or hanged, and he will be far too busy fighting for his own life to ever hunt me again." Silas reached out his large hand, covering hers over the leather bindings. "Then tomorrow we ride to town together. We send the books. We end it." And they did. 2 months later, the mountain burst into the vibrant, chaotic colors of late spring. The snow was completely gone, replaced by sprawling fields of wildflowers, purple lupine, and bright yellow buttercups. The creek that had nearly claimed their lives was now a babbling, sparkling ribbon of clear water. Word had reached Blackwood Ridge on the morning stagecoach. The Boston papers were ablaze with the scandal. Thaddeus Harrow's empire had collapsed under federal indictment. His properties were seized, his accomplices arrested, and Thaddeus himself was sitting in a federal penitentiary awaiting trial. The threat was gone. The ghosts of Clara's past had finally been laid to rest. Clara stood on the porch of the cabin, bathed in the warm golden light of the setting sun. She watched Silas and Wyatt in the yard teaching Levi how to fashion a proper snare. Cora was sitting on the steps braiding wildflowers into a crown. Silas looked up, wiping the sweat from his brow. He caught Clara's eye, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his bearded face. He handed the snare to Wyatt and walked toward the porch, his heavy boots thudding softly on the earth. He stepped up onto the porch, wrapping his massive arms around Clara from behind, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on the top of her head, inhaling the scent of lye soap and mountain air that clung to her hair. "You're quiet," Silas murmured, his large hands resting gently over her stomach. Clara leaned back into his solid warmth, placing her hands over his. "I was just thinking about the day I arrived here. I thought this mountain would be my grave." Silas tightened his hold on her. "And now?" "Now," Clara whispered, feeling the faint fluttering stir of new life deep within her womb, a secret she had shared with him only nights before in the quiet dark of their room. "Now I know it is where my life truly began." The brutal world had tried to break them both. It had frozen their bones and tested their spirits, but the harsh land could not kill their love. Out of the ice and the pain, the broken mountain man and the fugitive city girl had forged something unbreakable. They had found their sanctuary. They had found their home. If this story of Clara and Silas surviving the freezing mountain and finding warmth in each other's arms touched your heart, please leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have been brave enough to jump into the icy river to save a child who wasn't yours? Subscribe to our channel for more breathtaking frontier romances where the harshest lands forge the deepest loves. Until next time, stay warm and remember sometimes the greatest shelter is found in the arms of a broken protector.